We welcome Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Thank you for joining us to talk about the upcoming elections and the conversations at every dinner table in New York and the rest of the country.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Let's start big picture. On the 12th anniversary of DACA being issued by then President Obama, President Biden announced an expansion of that program, not only allowing recent graduates from a U.S. accredited institution with a degree who have a job offer to take it and expedite their work permits. In addition to that, President Biden is granting a path to citizenship, or at least permanent residence, to 500,000 people who are here undocumented but married to a U.S. citizen. Do you think that in the lead up to the election, this is the most that we could get?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that this is one of the largest expansions and shifts to address undocumented people since DACA, which is an enormous achievement for us to have. However, I do think, in order for us to have real systemic relief passed on the matter of immigration, it requires an act of Congress. So it's not just about President Biden, but we need both chambers of Congress to pass comprehensive immigration reform. And as we know, right now, currently, the House of Representatives is controlled by the Republican Party that has no interest in expanding a path to citizenship or helping people be more documented, which only underscores the importance of the November election. But I think what is important is that this path to relief is opening, and our hope is that we'll be able to keep fighting for greater protections, both in the short term and the long term.
Another related topic, highly contentious as well, is border security. And President Biden has proposed to close the border to asylum seekers if the number of undocumented crossings exceeds a certain number. What do you think should be done at the border to guarantee the security, national security of the United States, and to make sure that the U.S. continues to comply with international commitments, international law, and human rights?
Well, first and foremost, it's important to acknowledge that Congress and the president have already secured over $500 million in additional border security funding. And even in light of that, I also think it's important to acknowledge that I think that his recent executive order is highly concerning. The idea of limiting asylum seekers at such a low level, we have to understand that this is policy making not just for this president, but for any subsequent president. And to give the executive branch that power can be concerning. That being said, none of this also addresses the core issue at the heart of the immigration crisis in the United States, which is the fact that there is no functioning or reliable way to enter the United States in a documented fashion in a way that is nearly impossible or may take 30 or 40 years. And so truly the way that we can solve some of the chaos that we see at the border is by actually addressing and expanding a path to citizenship and making it easier to be documented in the United States.
What is it going to take for your Republican colleagues to approve that?
Well, I personally think that it's up to Democrats to win the election to approve it. I believe there are some, very few Republicans that might be willing to have a conversation about opening a path to citizenship, but we are frankly and unfortunately seeing that possibility narrow all the time. And so to me, I think it's really important that we fight for robust Democratic majorities that are capable and supportive, having Democrats that are supportive of comprehensive immigration reform as well.
Aside from a massive reform, so Republican states, at least 11 in the nation, have moved to adopt measures similar to Governor Abbott's in Texas, not only busing migrants to blue states and blue cities, but in addition to that, to deputizing local police to do the job of the federal government in terms of detaining suspected undocumented migrants. What needs to happen there?
I mean, I cannot emphasize enough how reckless and irresponsible these states and these governors are being with these kinds of policies. But not just that, these policies are not just dangerous, they are racist. Because once we start expanding that scope of enforcement to whoever is suspected of being an immigrant, that often translates to people who are suspected of being Latino. And what suspicion of being an immigrant or undocumented actually amounts to, especially when it comes to state level enforcement, can often be completely unfounded. And so I think that where appropriate, it's important that we challenge these policies in court, that we aggressively enforce civil rights and civil liberties at the federal level, and that we make sure that that federal law isn't being usurped illegally by state level governments.
And what will you tell your constituents who want to get involved and make a difference, even though they cannot vote in those states?
Well, I think that what's really important is that just because we can't vote in those states doesn't mean that we can't support people in those states. There are tons of ways to get involved, either in terms of whether it's in supporting immigrant rights organizations, whether it's in supporting candidates or races and phone banking and organizing for pro-immigrant candidates. And then also on top of that, there's a lot of people who do a lot of faith-based organizing as well through churches and houses of faith to help support incoming refugees.
From your platform, you're one of the most talked about members of Congress. You're also the youngest woman ever elected to Congress. In addition to that, you have, let's call it that, celebrity. People do follow you. You have a certain influence over the general public and the electorate. What do you say to young voters who are not excited about voting for President Biden? And what do you tell Republicans who are second guessing their vote for Trump given his 34 recent convictions, criminal convictions?
Well, on the former, when it comes to young people who feel hesitant about voting for the president, I think first and foremost, I want to say I understand that we're in a moment right now of generational transition in our politics. And I completely understand people who look at the political landscape and say, I want another option, or I want another choice. But to that, I think it's important to say, first and foremost, President Biden is not the only person on the ballot in November, and even just next Tuesday in our New York primary elections that are occurring in just under a week. We have thousands of candidates and elections that are happening in November. And if we want to actually shape the political landscape, it's very important that we do not give way to the fascist threat that Donald Trump represents, while also transforming who and what kinds of people can get elected based on the issues that we support. Now, when it comes to Republicans, who feel very hesitant to support President Trump due to the 34 felony counts that he has been not just indicted, but found guilty of. I understand that too, and I actually think that they're right to be. That and is not a matter of Republican or Democrat. It's a question of our democracy, and it's a question of the integrity of our government. And it is very, very, very dangerous to put someone who has been found guilty of 34 felony crimes into the White House. The threat that poses to us systemically has nothing to do with whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. I would hope that any Republican or any Democrat with 34 felony counts would have nowhere near a chance of approaching the White House.
And whoever's in the White House will select, among others, potentially 2 new members of the Supreme Court. And SCOTUS owes the American public some decisions. What is your take on the composition of the High Court right now based on the decisions that they have been issuing?
Well, I think it's really important for everyday people, New Yorkers and everyone across the country, to understand that we are in the middle of a corruption crisis on the Supreme Court. We are talking about multiple members of the Supreme Court that have been found in explosive investigatory reporting to have received millions of dollars in unreported gifts and contributions from people with special interests, whether they are millionaires or organizations with business before the court. And so these decisions are not about whether we agree with them or not. They are about whether we will support the corruption that led to and surrounded these decisions or not. And that is why I think it is also incredibly important that the stakes and what we recognize as what is on the line here in November is not just about one person or one individual. It is about our overall democracy and government writ large.
And now going back to the local level, according to census data, 52% of your constituents in District 14 are Hispanic, and 42% of households in the district make less than $50,000 a year combined. What is your message to your constituents about the work that you've been able to do and the work that you want to continue to do if elected for another term?
Well, first and foremost, I identify with my constituents and with my district very deeply. I come from a working class family. My mom was a domestic worker. She cleaned houses. And as a kid, I went with her and cleaned houses to afford, tutoring and other types of things so that I can do well in school. So it's not just something that I find important. It's why I ran for Congress and it's why I'm here. And it's also why I fight for policies like guaranteed, improved, and expanded Medicare for all. It's why I fight to improve the minimum wage. It's why I fight to make sure that we get fully funded NYCHA in our federal funds, and that we fight for the actual economic and including our immigration platform as well, because this is such a core part of the fabric of our city, and it's a core part to being able to survive in the city and this country as a working class family.
Very quickly, a question on congestion pricing. You said when the governor suspended indefinitely the implementation of the toll that it was malpractice in government. What exactly do you mean?
Congestion pricing, whether we agree with it or not, or no matter what one's stance is a policy that was developed deliberatively. It was approved through the legislature, through the state assembly, through the state senate, and approved and signed by the governor herself. And so this is the work of policy making. The budget was established and built based off of the revenue that congestion pricing was going to bring in. And I want to be very clear that congestion pricing is not just about a tax, and it's not just about a toll. This was the financial plan to make sure that people could get elevators into their subway stations, that families and people with disabilities could be able to access the subway, so that we can make the capital improvements and the infrastructure improvements, so that we're not waiting for the L train or the 6 train or the 7 train for 40 minutes on a Saturday. If we want our subways to improve, this was the financial plan that was established and agreed to make that happen. And so to pull the plug on that right before its implementation and to blow a 15, in order to blow a massive, massive multi-million-dollar hole in the state budget as a result, to me, is malpractice. And I want to be very clear about one additional point, is that when we blow holes in our public transit budget, that money does not come out of the Times Square station. It doesn't come out of the Brooklyn Bridge. It doesn't come out of Battery Park or Prospect Park. It comes out of working class neighborhoods. It comes out of servicing train stations like Parkchester in the Bronx that has some of the longest commute times in all of New York City. It comes out of the working class neighborhoods, and it comes out of the working class, maintenance for the working class subway stations that we have. And so that, to me, is the added injustice of this. And that is why I think it was a completely incorrect decision that I could not disagree with more.
Now, moving on to, excuse me, sorry, gosh. Moving on to campaign finances, you made your first ever contribution to the campaign arm of the House Democrats back in April, $260,000 for the Voter Protection Program. And you said that the Democratic House leadership had finally changed. How would you like to see that money spent?
Well, the whole reason we earmarked those funds, and I earmarked those funds, is because we need to make massive investments in voter protections and civil rights protections at the ballot box and beyond, not just in New York, but across the country. We are seeing people's right to vote, especially in Black communities and states like Georgia and in other states across the country. We are seeing people's civil liberties under attack. We are seeing unprecedented levels of voter intimidation. And it's extremely important that we fund and finance a well-organized operation to defend people's rights, to poll watch, and to make sure that people have someone to advocate for them if they feel like their rights are being infringed.
Congresswoman, thank you. I have one last question. So it's not the first time, but you're facing a challenger, somebody who self-funded his campaign and who says that you are too extreme, but calls himself a progressive. Why do you think he's wrong?
Well, First and foremost, we're contending with someone who does not live in New York City, who lives in Dobbs Ferry in Westchester County, running to somehow represent people in the Bronx and Queens. But more important, what we are also seeing is someone that comes from Wall Street. And what that means is that if you are a self-financed person that's a wealthy Wall Street banker, of course you're going to think that guaranteeing health care to everyday people is radical. Of course you're going to think that women having rights over their own bodies is radical. Of course you're going to think that during Pride Month, equal protections and rights to our LGBT, especially our trans community, is radical. And so if he wants to call me radical for fighting for the people of our city, go ahead. But to me, I think that it's common sense, and I think that it's the right thing to do for the country.
Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, thank you for being with us.
Of course.